Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most peculiar chapters in history, the most unusual medieval punishments ever used. Strange devices like forgotten tools from a blacksmith's dim workshop, rusted and heavy, waiting silently in corners as time slowly drifts past them unnoticed. Before you get comfortable, like and subscribe if you enjoy these slow dives into the past, and comment your location and time. It's always fascinating to see who is joining from around the world, drifting off together into these quiet, almost forgotten corners of history. Now let us ease into the discovery of these punishments, not with any rush or drama, but with a steady rhythm. The way they first appeared in medieval records, written quietly in ledgers, one entry after another, preserved by careful hands over many years. We begin in the year 1215, inside the damp stone halls of a monastery in southern England, where a monk named Brother Elias sits beside a flickering candle, his quill scratching softly across parchment as rain taps gently against narrow windows of cold gray stone. It is a Tuesday in early autumn, a quiet day where fog clings low across distant fields, and the air carries the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, while Brother Elias continues his work, not searching for anything remarkable, only copying older documents from fading royal archives. These documents had been gathered after the sealing of a great charter that year, and while it only briefly mentioned punishments, Elias preserved the overlooked details, writing carefully as ink spread slightly on damp parchment, each word becoming part of a slow and enduring record. Step by step, he transcribes the first punishment we encounter, the ordeal of cold water, where suspects were bound tightly at the hands and feet, then lowered slowly into a pond blessed by a priest, the surface closing gently above them. The water, chilled by the turning season, would ripple softly as bubbles rose upward, and records describe how these ponds were chosen carefully, often in low-lying areas where currents were weak and the muddy bottom was thick with reeds and stillness. Brother Elias copied this from an earlier charter, dated long before his time, noting how even the pond's depth was measured precisely, usually around 6 feet, enough to submerge the body fully, yet not always intended to bring immediate death. Outside, the weather remained overcast, a light drizzle continuing through the day, smearing ink in small places, yet Elias persisted, turning page after page, his work steady and methodical, preserving these quiet details that might otherwise have disappeared into silence. From there, the discoveries unfold further, carried into the archives gathered during tense meetings between barons, where damp clothing clung to their shoulders beneath gray skies, and chests of legal scrolls were opened slowly, their iron locks creaking in the still air. Inside one such chest lay descriptions of the scold's bridle, an unusual punishment used in village life, carefully detailed in scrolls that described its iron frame fitting tightly over the head, with a flat piece pressing down upon the tongue. Chains connected the structure to a frame resting on the shoulders like a heavy yoke, and the record noted its weight, enough to strain the neck after hours of walking slowly through muddy village streets, while onlookers watched in quiet routine. Day after day, as more documents were uncovered, these punishments emerged not dramatically, but gradually, discovered in libraries and abbeys where scribes worked through misty mornings, their breath visible in the cold air as they turned fragile, aging pages. In one such place, a cleric uncovered a variant of the pillory, where petty thieves were restrained, yet with an added cruelty, their ears slowly cut with a dull heated blade, the process stretching across hours beneath shifting skies. Around them, ordinary life continued, vendors selling bread and fish nearby, while blood dripped quietly onto stone, and no one hurried, as the punishment became simply another part of the slow rhythm of the day. In these scriptoria, monks labored through winter months, fingers stiff from cold, mixing ink from oak galls and iron salts, carefully copying repeated descriptions, each punishment recorded again and again across years, unchanged in wording and steady in tone. One such record described the tumbrel cart, used for brewers accused of selling weak ale, a simple wooden wagon pulled through uneven streets, wheels creaking softly while everyday life continued around it without interruption or urgency. Further south, during a dry and dusty summer, another clerk uncovered references to the ducking stool, a sturdy chair fixed to a pole used to lower individuals repeatedly into slow-moving river water, thick with silt and drifting debris. The rope used for this was described in detail, braided hemp worn from repeated use, and the act itself was carried out slowly, the stool lowered again and again, while willows hung over the water and insects droned in the heavy heat. Elsewhere, records describe the iron gauntlet, a device fitted onto the hand, where pressure was applied gradually through a turning screw, the interior lined with rough metal that pressed inward while time stretched quietly in dim stone spaces. These discoveries continued across regions and years, appearing in chronicles and municipal rolls, each one uncovered not in moments of urgency, but in still, ordinary days filled with copying, reading, and the slow preservation of routine details. In Scotland, another device emerged from records, a metal frame fitted around the head, worn for hours as individuals were paraded slowly through damp streets, the rain falling lightly while life carried on around them without pause. In warmer regions, logs describe punishments carried out under intense sun, where wooden structures were carefully maintained, oiled to prevent damage, and used repeatedly in courtyards where dust settled quietly across the ground. In the Low Countries, clerks noted chairs lined with inward-pointing nails, where individuals were seated carefully, pressure building gradually as movement became difficult, all recorded in calm, precise handwriting under dim candlelight. Even in busy cities, punishments were carried out without haste, carts moving slowly through streets as vendors sold food nearby, the sound of wheels blending into the ordinary noise of daily life, unchanged and continuous. And so, these records reveal themselves not through dramatic events, but through the quiet persistence of those who documented them, their quills moving steadily across parchment as seasons passed from rain to frost to mild sun. Layer by layer, these punishments emerge from the stillness of archives, each one a thread in a much larger fabric, woven slowly through routine, repetition, and the unhurried passage of time that defined the medieval world. We continue now with the physical description of these unusual medieval punishments, cataloging them inch by texture, as they endured through centuries of damp storage and occasional use, preserved in the slow decay of castle armories and shadowed church vaults. Day after day, year after year, their iron rusted in quiet layers, wood warped under cycles of rain and frost, and fabrics frayed from the oils of countless hands. Each mark a small reminder of repeated use and long periods of stillness in forgotten corners. Begin with the scold's bridle, an iron contraption meant to silence gossip in village lanes, its frame measuring 14 inches across, forged from hammered wrought iron, the surface pitted with marks and coated in greenish corrosion from exposure to damp morning air. The bit, a flat plate about 2 inches wide and half an inch thick, presses firmly against the tongue, its edges filed blunt yet still scraping with every swallow, carrying a faint metallic taste shaped by old residue hardened over long and repeated use. Chains hang loosely, each link slightly bent from strain, connecting to a hoop encircling the head like a heavy crown, once padded with leather that has since cracked and stiffened, hinting at long hours of wear during ordinary daily routines in village life. Wear appears in loosened rivets and strained joints, shaped by repeated parades through muddy streets where rain turned pathways into thick slurry, clinging to clothing, while the device remained fixed in place, unmoving against the slow rhythm of passing time. Some bridles were preserved in quiet attic spaces of guild halls, hanging from beams for centuries, gathering dust through winters of drifting snow and summers of dry heat, the iron gradually flaking and settling below in fine powder like ash. These halls often faced north, rarely touched by sunlight, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and decay, while the metal slowly oxidized in the damp, forming uneven textures that continued to change long after the device had fallen out of use. Next comes the cold water ordeal's remains, a fragment of stone basin, its surface worn smooth inside from repeated contact with rope and water, The texture softened over time like wet sand beneath steady pressure and constant exposure. The basin's edges remain rough, the stone carrying traces of long submersion, and one can imagine the chill of water settling slowly into cloth, the heaviness building as fabric absorbed moisture, while the surrounding air stayed cool and overcast. Preserved underground for centuries, layers of clay sealed the structure in place, tree roots twisting around it gradually, while seasons passed above unnoticed, each year adding another quiet layer of stillness to its long and undisturbed existence. The pillory stands tall in description, a post of oak rising several feet, its surface marked by knots and grain patterns dulled by repeated shaping, while the base stocks, once secured with leather, now show only fragile remnants worn down over time. Nearby rests a cropping knife, its blade nicked and uneven, the metal dulled through long exposure to salt air, preserved in storage where shifting coastal winds slowly altered its surface, leaving behind a textured patina shaped by years of neglect. The tumbrel cart follows, its wooden wheels slightly warped, spokes bending from uneven roads, while the axle once coated in grease now holds traces hardened into cracks, carrying the faint memory of repeated motion through narrow, crowded streets. The seat, worn hollow at its center, shows the pressure of use over time, while coarse ropes once used for restraint carry the texture of repeated tension, absorbing moisture and scent from surrounding environments shaped by riverbanks and open air. Stored in barn lofts for centuries, such carts gathered layers of dust and cobwebs, while seasonal changes caused the wood to expand and contract slowly, preserving within it the quiet record of changing weather across many passing years. The ducking stool appears next, its oak frame smoothed in places yet splintered along edges, supported by iron bands weakened by rust, while long poles and thick ropes show the strain of repeated use and constant exposure to water. Gouges and marks remain visible along its surface, shaped by gripping hands in movement, while the wood itself darkened over time, absorbing moisture from flooding waters and still air within enclosed spaces where it was eventually stored. The iron gauntlet follows, shaped like a rigid glove, its articulated fingers stiff from disuse, with interior points worn dull, and a turning mechanism that once applied steady pressure now frozen in place by time and corrosion. Inside, remnants of lining have broken down into fragments, while the outer metal holds layers of discoloration, formed slowly as air and moisture interacted with its surface over decades of storage within enclosed stone spaces. The brank mask expands on the earlier design, forming a full cage around the face, its bars closely spaced, with internal pieces positioned to restrict movement, and surfaces marked by corrosion and environmental exposure. Its weight rests unevenly on a collar structure, while the entire frame shows signs of long-term storage in open attic spaces, where wind, dust, and small disturbances gradually shaped its current worn and fragile condition. The Spanish donkey presents a wooden beam supported on trestles, its surface worn along the ridge, while attached weights show signs of repeated handling, their rough surfaces carrying marks from long periods of use and later abandonment. The surrounding wood bears darkened patches from exposure to heat and soot, while seasonal changes caused expansion and contraction, slowly altering its shape as it remained in enclosed spaces affected by both temperature and moisture shifts. The cathedral lignia chair appears next, its seat lined with rows of metal points, each one slightly loosened over time as the wood softened, while the structure itself shows signs of repeated exposure to damp environments near water. Seasonal rising and falling moisture levels affected its condition, leaving the air around it heavy and still, while the materials slowly absorbed these changes, preserving subtle details within their worn and aging surfaces. Finally, the jeering cart stands as a simple wagon structure, its wooden frame weakened, canvas covering reduced to fragments, and internal spaces filled over time with debris gathered during long periods of storage. Its wheels, though still intact, show the effects of time, while surrounding conditions allowed small animals and moisture to reshape its interior, leaving behind a quiet record of abandonment in narrow enclosed spaces. Inch by inch, these artifacts persist, their textures shaped by time's steady passage, their surfaces holding traces of countless environments, preserved not through careful care, but through long neglect and shadowed places where seasons quietly continued. We turn now to the scientific analysis of these unusual medieval punishments, moving slowly through the forensics of bone and metal, where isotopes reveal diet and injuries are catalogued layer by layer, reconstructing the quiet, repetitive routines of lives lived day after day. We begin with victims of the Scold's Bridle, whose remains were studied from excavations in York, where jawbones revealed enamel worn flat along molars, with fine fractures spreading across the surface like faint cracks forming in winter frost on still, unmoving glass. Isotope analysis of teeth shows traces of local soils and simple grain-based diets, suggesting lives shaped by routine, with mornings beginning beside hearth fires, preparing basic meals, and days continuing through repetitive domestic work carried out under cool and often damp conditions. Daily patterns emerge gradually, with early rising, tending to animals in mist-covered fields, followed by household labor, hands exposed to cold and water, while silence imposed by the device altered only speech, leaving thought and routine otherwise unchanged. Physical evidence suggests healed injuries along the jaw, with irregular bone surfaces indicating past trauma, while overall health appears moderate, shaped by continuous manual effort, and small signs of joint wear point toward repetitive movements carried out over many years. Further testing places these remains within a specific historical range, with environmental markers reflecting local climate patterns, including mild winters and reliance on groundwater sources, suggesting a steady and unvaried pattern of daily sustenance and living conditions. We move next to evidence associated with the pillory, where skeletal remains show signs of sharp trauma around ear regions, with bone surfaces indicating healing processes that were incomplete, revealing how injuries persisted over time without full recovery. Chemical traces within bones suggest diets that included preserved fish and simple grains, pointing to coastal or river-based living, while daily routines likely involved early activity, movement through narrow streets, and constant exposure to crowded environments. Patterns of wear on the skeleton indicate active movement, followed by periods of forced stillness, where the body remained fixed for extended durations, leading to localized stress and gradual changes in posture reflected within the bones themselves. Analysis of remains linked to the tumbrel punishment reveals evidence of prolonged exposure to water, with subtle changes in bone density suggesting repeated cold stress, while environmental particles found within remains indicate contact with riverine conditions. Dietary traces suggest heavy reliance on grain-based foods and fermented liquids, while reconstructed routines point to work carried out in enclosed, humid environments, followed by repeated exposure to outdoor elements during the act of punishment. The ducking stool cases show similar patterns, with skeletal indicators pointing to repeated immersion, and joint stress suggesting sudden movements under restraint, while chemical signatures indicate diets shaped by dairy and simple agricultural produce. From these findings, daily life appears structured around market activity, with regular movement through public spaces, followed by domestic tasks carried out in the evening, forming a predictable rhythm that continued over long periods of time. In the case of the iron gauntlet, skeletal remains show compression injuries in the hands, with fractures following distinct mechanical patterns, suggesting gradual application of force rather than sudden trauma, leaving lasting structural changes in the bones. Chemical evidence reflects diets including locally produced food and drink, while reconstructed routines suggest time spent in social environments before confinement, followed by prolonged periods of limited movement affecting circulation and joint condition. Brank mask evidence reveals changes in skull and jaw structure, with signs of prolonged pressure and restricted movement, while isotopic data suggests diets based on simple grains, supporting a routine centered on domestic and small-scale craft activity. Patterns of strain appear along the neck and upper spine, indicating the physical burden of wearing the device, while daily life likely continued within familiar surroundings, shaped more by repetition than by variation. Analysis of remains associated with the Spanish donkey indicates stress fractures and structural strain along the lower body, suggesting extended periods of weight-bearing in fixed positions, leading to gradual weakening over time. Dietary evidence points toward regional food patterns, while reconstructed routines suggest long periods of stillness interrupted only by environmental changes, with the body adapting slowly to sustained physical stress. The cathedra lignia cases reveal compression along lower skeletal structures, with repeated pressure leaving subtle but consistent marks, while isotopic data reflects diets based on staple crops prepared in simple, repetitive ways. Daily routines inferred from these remains suggest confinement and limited movement, with time passing in enclosed spaces, where environmental conditions remain stable, reinforcing a sense of monotony and repetition. Finally, remains linked to the jeering cart show patterns of wear, consistent with repeated movement over uneven ground, with skeletal stress reflecting prolonged sitting and constant vibration during transport through public spaces. Dietary traces suggest access to basic urban food sources, while reconstructed routines point to movement through crowded environments, followed by return to confined living spaces, forming a continuous cycle of activity and stillness. Layer by layer, these forensic details rebuild lives shaped by repetition, where meals remain simple, movements predictable, and physical conditions gradually changed over time, preserving within bone and trace elements a quiet record of endurance. We arrive now at the mysteries and theories surrounding these unusual medieval punishments, moving slowly through unanswered questions, where intent and accident blur together within incomplete records, and where debate continues quietly, carried forward into modern interpretations that fade gently into disuse. First, the scold's bridle raises questions, as some individuals appear repeatedly in records, enduring the device many times, suggesting either unusual tolerance or social dynamics that place them again and again into the same cycle of punishment. One theory suggests adaptation over time, where nightly remedies or simple coping methods may have reduced discomfort, allowing individuals to continue daily routines, working through repetitive domestic tasks, despite the lingering effects carried quietly from one day into the next. Other interpretations propose that these punishments may have extended beyond their stated purpose, possibly linked to disputes over property or personal conflicts, with official reasoning masking deeper tensions that unfolded slowly within communities over long periods. There are also records hinting at unintended consequences, where the device may have caused harm beyond expectation, raising questions about whether all outcomes were intentional or simply the result of design limitations interacting with unpredictable conditions. In modern times, the bridle survives mostly as a preserved object, displayed in museums or referenced in historical discussions, where its presence now invites reflection rather than action, existing quietly behind glass in controlled and silent environments. Turning to the cold water ordeal, one mystery lies in the recorded outcomes, where results appear uneven, prompting theories about environmental factors, body positioning, or variations in preparation that may have influenced what was observed at the time. Some interpretations consider the role of clothing and trapped air, while others focus on the conditions of the water itself, suggesting that natural elements may have contributed to outcomes that were later interpreted as meaningful within the belief systems of the period. Debates also explore whether certain outcomes were influenced deliberately, though evidence remains incomplete, leaving open the possibility that both natural variation and human intervention played roles that cannot now be fully separated. Today, many of these sites have become quiet natural spaces, where water flows undisturbed, and the past is studied through research and discussion rather than reenactment, the environment returning gradually to a more neutral state over time. The pillory presents its own questions, particularly regarding the healing of injuries, where surviving evidence suggests irregular recovery patterns, leading to speculation about treatment methods or individual variation in physical response. Some theories point to the tools themselves, suggesting that variations in sharpness or handling may have influenced outcomes, while others consider the possibility of informal medical practices applied afterward with uncertain effectiveness. Infections appear frequently in the evidence, raising further questions about environmental conditions and the limited understanding of hygiene, contributing to outcomes that extended beyond the initial act and into longer-term physical effects. Modern reflections focus more on reconstruction and study, with replicas and educational displays offering insight into structure and use, while the original context remains distant, interpreted through fragments rather than direct observation. The tumbrel punishment raises questions about its selective application, with certain professions appearing more frequently in records, suggesting possible social or economic influences shaping how and when it was used. Patterns of repeated exposure also appear in records, leading to speculation about long-term effects and whether such repetition may have contributed to broader health issues that were not fully understood at the time. Today, references to such devices appear occasionally in cultural contexts, often simplified or symbolic, while the original function has long since disappeared into history, leaving only structural descriptions and written accounts. The ducking stool presents another set of uncertainties, particularly regarding structural reliability, with records noting occasional failures that may have resulted from wear, environmental stress, or simple material fatigue over time. Some theories suggest that such failures were accidental, while others leave open the possibility of deliberate interference, though evidence remains limited, leaving the question unresolved and open to interpretation. In modern contexts, these devices are remembered primarily through historical markers or educational material, where their presence is quiet and reflective, far removed from their original use. The Iron Gauntlet introduces questions about consistency, as records show variation in application, leading to speculation about whether procedures were standardized or adapted based on circumstances or individual judgment. The physical effects recorded suggest a gradual application of force, though the exact method and reasoning remain uncertain, leaving room for differing interpretations based on available evidence and reconstructed understanding. Today, such devices are studied mainly for their mechanical aspects, with attention given to structure and function rather than use, reflecting a shift toward analysis rather than replication. The Brank mask presents questions about its effectiveness, with some accounts suggesting that individuals found ways to adapt, raising the possibility of informal knowledge shared within communities over time. These adaptations, if they occurred, remain difficult to confirm, but they highlight the interaction between design and human response, where outcomes were not always entirely controlled or predictable. In the present day, the mask exists largely as a symbolic object, referenced in discussions about history and culture, its physical presence reduced to preserved examples and reconstructed models. The Spanish donkey raises questions about variation in use, with conflicting records describing different methods, suggesting that practices may have differed depending on location or circumstance. Structural weaknesses also appear in descriptions, indicating that materials may not always have held under stress, leading to outcomes shaped as much by construction as by intent. Today, it is remembered primarily within curated spaces, where it stands as an example of historical design, viewed quietly by visitors moving through controlled environments. The cathedra lignia presents uncertainty in its construction, with variations in design suggesting possible differences in purpose or available resources, leaving its exact form somewhat open to interpretation. Debates continue regarding whether its primary impact was physical or psychological, with evidence supporting elements of both, though neither can be fully isolated from the other. In modern times, its presence is largely conceptual, appearing in academic discussions or artistic representations, rather than in physical or functional form. Finally, the jeering cart raises questions about its repetitive roots, suggesting that its design may have been intended to reinforce familiarity, or simply reflected practical limitations in movement through urban spaces. Some theories propose that individuals adapted to its use in unexpected ways, though such interpretations remain speculative, based on limited and indirect evidence preserved in records. Today, it appears mainly in cultural references and staged representations, where its original context is softened and reframed within modern perspectives. These mysteries remain unresolved, with theories layered upon one another, each adding detail without final certainty. While the artifacts themselves rest quietly in storage, their surfaces continue to age slowly. And so, the most unusual medieval punishments ever used settle into silence. Preserved within archives and collections, their stories carried forward gently through study and reflection. Good night. Now we begin not with the punishment itself, but with the way it first appears in surviving records, almost accidentally, as part of legal documentation that was never meant to be read like a story. One of the earliest clearer mentions comes from late medieval England, in the kind of judicial archive stored in stone buildings that were slightly damp all year round, where parchment slowly absorbed moisture from the air regardless of season. In one such archive, in a town that had grown around a market square and a small church, a clerk sits in a narrow room lit by a weak window. The year is not important to him in a personal sense, only in a filing sense. It is just another day of copying older legal entries into a newer register. Outside, there's the steady sound of carts passing over uneven stone, wheels occasionally catching in grooves worn down over decades. The clerk's name is not recorded in most modern retellings, because clerks were rarely meant to be remembered individually. His job is simple, repetitive, and slow. He copies, he corrects. He occasionally stops to scrape dried ink from the tip of his quill. The air smells faintly of old straw, ink, and the smoke of a fire that never quite warms the whole room. In the document he is copying, there is a reference to a sentence used for severe cases of treason, a punishment described not in emotional language, but in procedural terms. The wording is dry, almost indifferent, as if describing the movement of goods rather than the end of a life. The phrase itself appears alongside lists of fines, confiscations, and property disputes, as though it belongs in the same category of administrative action. What is notable in these early references is not dramatic detail, but absence of it. There's no storytelling voice in the original records. There is no explanation of moral weight. There is only structure, steps, sequences, the kind of language that suggests the punishment was understood by everyone involved, and therefore did not need elaboration. From there, the record leads us outward, slowly, to the spaces where such punishments were actually carried out, or at least discussed. Often these are not grand public squares as later imagination suggests, but edges of towns, fields near roads, or open areas outside gates where the ground was uneven and grass grew in irregular patches depending on drainage. On the morning of one recorded case, the weather is described in passing notes as overcast, with a low sky that made everything look slightly closer than it should. Not stormy, not calm, just an ordinary heavy sky that made distances feel shorter. The kind of weather that does not interrupt work, only slightly changes its mood. Officials gather not with ceremony, but with practical coordination. There are lists to check. There are instructions to confirm. There is wood being carried, ropes being examined, and horses being held steady by handlers who are more focused on footing than on what the horses might be witnessing. The term drawn and quartered itself, in its recorded usage, is not always presented as a single unified act in early texts. Instead, it appears as a combination of procedures that were sometimes separated, sometimes combined, and sometimes recorded differently depending on the scribe. This inconsistency is one of the quiet difficulties historians face, because medieval documentation is rarely standardized in the modern sense. In some entries, the language focuses on transport. In others, on dismemberment. In others still, on the legal justification that precedes it. The result is a fragmented picture, like viewing the same object through different pieces of glass, each slightly distorted, none fully complete. What we can reconstruct with more certainty is the environment around it. The ground is often described as damp or uneven. The air is often cool, regardless of season, because many recorded instances take place early in the day. People present are rarely described emotionally. Instead, they are listed by role: sheriff, clerk, executioner, witnesses, soldiers. Each person positioned as part of a system, rather than as an individual reacting to events. In one account, the executioner is described only through his tools and his waiting posture. He stands slightly apart, not interacting unless necessary, as if conserving movement. Nearby, someone records details on parchment, occasionally pausing when ink flow becomes inconsistent, adjusting pressure on the quill to maintain clarity. There's also attention to preparation, which modern readers often overlook. Preparation is a large part of the record. Rope lengths are measured, horses are selected, timber is inspected. Nothing is rushed, because the process is procedural rather than spontaneous. Even the timing is structured around civic routine, avoiding market peak hours, avoiding religious services, fitting instead into the quieter segments of the day. Occasionally, the records drift into description of the condemned, but even then, the language remains restrained. Age might be mentioned, sometimes occupation, sometimes origin, rarely anything more. These individuals are not described as characters, but as entries, existing briefly within administrative memory, before disappearing again into the structure of the document. One recurring detail in several regions is the emphasis on transport through public space, not for spectacle in the modern sense, but as a procedural requirement. Streets are noted as being cleared in advance, not dramatically emptied, but simply adjusted. People step aside. Work pauses briefly, then resumes. A bakery continues baking. A blacksmith continues working. A well continues being used. Life does not stop in totality. It only shifts slightly, like a slow tide moving around a fixed object. And so, in these early fragments, what we begin to see is not a single event, but a system of recorded steps embedded in a society that treated punishment as part of governance, not separate from it. Everything is procedural. Everything is logged. Everything is placed into the same structure as taxes, land disputes, and property transfers. There is no final commentary in these records. No moral conclusion. Only the continuation of documentation, as if the purpose of writing was not to explain meaning, but to ensure that nothing was left unrecorded, even if it would later be difficult to interpret. And in that quiet, administrative tone, the earliest traces of this punishment begin to emerge, not as spectacle, but as routine entries in the long and indifferent ledger of medieval governance. We now move from the written records into the physical descriptions of what these punishments were said to involve, reconstructed through later accounts, legal summaries, and fragmented descriptions preserved in copies that often disagreed slightly with each other, depending on who recorded them and when they were written down. The language used in these descriptions is still restrained, almost mechanical, as if the writers were more concerned with accuracy of steps than with the human body itself, breaking the process into parts that could be listed, measured, and repeated without emotional interpretation. In the descriptions associated with drawn and quartered punishments, the body is not presented as a whole narrative, but as a sequence of movements and separations, each step recorded in isolation, as though the goal was clarity of procedure rather than reflection on outcome. The records often begin with restraint, noting that the individual is secured in place using ropes or bindings, described in simple terms, usually with attention to firmness and position, ensuring that movement is limited before any further steps are taken in the process. The materials used for restraint are rarely described in detail, though rope appears frequently, sometimes noted as coarse hemp, sometimes as standard utility cord used across multiple civic tasks, suggesting that specialized materials were not always considered necessary for this stage. From there, the descriptions shift to transport or positioning, where the body is moved into an open area or prepared space, often noted as uneven ground, sometimes damp, sometimes dusty, depending on the season and recent weather conditions in the region. Accounts frequently mention horses or wooden supports. though the level of detail varies widely, with some records focusing on mechanical arrangement, and others only noting that multiple animals or structures were involved in creating controlled directional force. What stands out in many of these accounts is the absence of sensory description from the original scribes, replaced instead by later commentary added in margins or copied from oral retellings that attempted to explain what earlier documents left unsaid. Preservation of these accounts comes primarily from legal codices stored in municipal archives, often in rooms with thick stone walls where temperature remained relatively stable, though humidity slowly affected parchment over long periods of storage. Ink in these documents sometimes faded unevenly, leading to partial gaps in instruction sequences, which later historians attempted to reconstruct by comparing multiple versions of similar records from neighboring regions, each with slight variations in phrasing and order. In some cases, the descriptions include reference to tools used for separation, though terminology is inconsistent, with words for cutting instruments varying depending on language, region, and the occupational background of the scribe recording the event. The materials of these tools are generally described as metal, though specifics about composition are rarely included, leaving modern interpretation to infer based on surviving artifacts from the same general period and geographical areas. Wooden components are also mentioned, often as support structures, beams, or frames, usually described as ash or oak, depending on local availability, with notes occasionally made about wear from repeated use in civic and agricultural contexts. Preservation of physical artifacts associated with these descriptions is rare, as most were either repurposed or decayed over time, leaving only indirect evidence through tool marks, structural impressions, and written inventories of municipal equipment. Where physical remnants do exist, they are typically fragmented, stored in museum collections where they are cataloged not by function alone, but by material composition, corrosion patterns, and contextual association with legal documentation. Metal components often show layered oxidation, indicating long exposure to air and moisture, while wooden remains, when present, tend to survive only in dry or waterlogged environments that slow decomposition under specific environmental conditions. The descriptions also include references to clothing, usually minimal, sometimes removed prior to procedures, though phrasing varies and is often indirect, focusing more on preparation than on personal detail of the individuals involved. Clothing materials are noted in passing as wool, linen, or mixed fabric depending on social status, with occasional references to wear patterns that indicate long-term use rather than items prepared specifically for any single event. Environmental context is frequently included in these records, though again in a subdued manner, mentioning ground conditions, air temperature, and general seasonal state rather than dramatic weather descriptions or emotionally charged language. Some accounts suggest public presence, but describe it as arranged space rather than crowd behavior, with emphasis placed on order, positioning, and civic control of movement within designated boundaries. Preservation of knowledge about these punishments often depends on later copies made during administrative reforms, when older records were recopied into newer formats, sometimes introducing subtle changes in terminology or sequence. These copying processes were slow, performed in quiet rooms where scribes worked for hours at a time, occasionally pausing to correct ink flow or compare passages with earlier manuscripts to ensure consistency. Marginal notes sometimes appear, added by later readers who attempted to clarify ambiguous steps, though these notes vary in reliability and often reflect interpretation rather than original documentation. Over centuries, the physical manuscripts themselves accumulated signs of handling, including smudged ink, softened edges, and occasional repairs made with stitched parchment patches or reinforcement strips along weakened folds. Storage conditions played a significant role in preservation, with some documents surviving in relatively dry archives, while others were affected by damp air, leading to curling edges and faded lettering that required careful transcription. Modern reconstruction of these descriptions relies heavily on cross-referencing multiple sources, aligning fragmented sentences into coherent sequences while acknowledging that complete certainty about exact procedures is not always possible. Despite this uncertainty, the structure of the records consistently reflects a procedural mindset, where actions are broken into steps and recorded in sequence, emphasizing process over interpretation or narrative detail. This approach to documentation allows historians to trace not only what was recorded, but how information itself was organized in medieval administrative systems, where clarity of instruction was prioritized over emotional context. In this way, the physical descriptions we have today are less like stories and more like operational outlines, preserved through centuries of copying, translation, and archival storage under varying environmental conditions. Even when details differ, the underlying structure remains similar, suggesting a shared framework of legal and procedural thinking that shaped how such punishments were recorded across different regions. And so, what remains is not a complete physical reconstruction, but a layered collection of descriptions, artifacts, and copies, each contributing partial information to a broader but still incomplete understanding. We will now continue into analysis of the individuals themselves, their lives reconstructed through scientific methods, diet, injury patterns, and the slow biological traces left behind in bone and soil. We move now into the slower work of scientific reconstruction, where the fragments left behind are not read as narrative, but as data gathered carefully from burial sites, disturbed ground layers, and skeletal remains that were not originally meant to be studied, yet have remained quietly beneath the surface for centuries, waiting in stillness. In several excavation sites across England, partial remains believed to be associated with severe judicial punishments have been recovered not as complete skeletons, but as separated elements found at varying depths, sometimes in shallow deposits near old roadways, sometimes closer to settlement edges where soil had been turned repeatedly over time. The condition of these remains varies, depending largely on soil composition, drainage, and seasonal cycles that affected decomposition rates. In clay-heavy soil, bones tend to remain more intact, though stained darker, while in sandy or acidic soil, fragmentation occurs more rapidly, leaving only partial structures for analysis. From these remains, osteologists begin with the most consistent markers, estimating age through joint wear, dental condition, and bone density. Many individuals fall within ranges typical of active working populations, with skeletal indicators showing long-term physical labor rather than sedentary lifestyles. Teeth, often the most durable element, provide additional information through isotopic analysis. Ratios of carbon and nitrogen suggest diets dominated by grains, with occasional inclusion of animal protein, though this varies by region and economic status, indicating patterns of subsistence rather than variation. Strontium isotopes present in tooth enamel reveal geographical consistency in many cases, suggesting that individuals remained within a limited area for most of their lives, rather than moving frequently across regions, reinforcing the idea of localized communities with stable but repetitive routines. Daily life, reconstructed from these patterns, appears steady and unvaried. Mornings begin early, often before full daylight, with tasks such as tending animals, preparing simple meals, or maintaining tools. These routines repeat across seasons, shifting only slightly depending on weather and daylight length. Evidence of repetitive strain appears frequently in the skeleton, particularly in joints of the shoulders, elbows, and knees. These patterns align with activities such as lifting, carrying, grinding grain, or working soil, all of which produce gradual wear rather than sudden injury. In some cases, trauma markers are present, though they are not always clearly linked to punishment events themselves. Healed fractures, irregular bone growth, and joint misalignment suggest previous injuries that were survived, indicating resilience within physically demanding environments. Where more severe damage is observed, interpretation becomes more complex. Fragmentation patterns may indicate post-mortem separation or environmental effects, rather than direct evidence of specific procedures, requiring cautious analysis to avoid drawing conclusions beyond what the evidence supports. Burial context also plays a significant role in interpretation. Some remains are found in formal burial grounds, suggesting reintegration into community practices after death, while others are located in less structured deposits, where placement appears less deliberate or more influenced by external conditions. Soil layers surrounding remains often contain additional clues, including plant material, small artifacts, or changes in sediment composition that indicate seasonal conditions at the time of burial. These details help narrow timeframes, though rarely to precise dates. Chemical traces within bones can also indicate long-term health conditions. Signs of nutritional deficiency appear in some cases, reflected in bone density variations and dental wear, suggesting limited access to varied diet over extended periods. In contrast, some individuals show relatively stable health markers, indicating that even within structured systems of punishment, general living conditions prior to death may not have been uniformly poor, but instead varied depending on occupation and local environment. DNA preservation is inconsistent, often degraded beyond full reconstruction, though partial sequences sometimes provide insight into ancestry and familial patterns within small populations. These findings reinforce the localized nature of communities during the period. Reconstruction of daily routine remains one of the more interpretive aspects of analysis. Based on skeletal indicators and environmental context, individuals likely followed highly repetitive schedules, with little variation beyond seasonal adjustments. Meals would have been simple, often consisting of grains prepared in basic forms, supplemented occasionally with vegetables or small amounts of meat, depending on availability and economic standing within the community. Movement patterns inferred from bone structure suggest regular walking over uneven terrain, carrying loads, and performing tasks that required sustained physical effort rather than short bursts of activity. These movements, repeated daily, leave lasting impressions on the body. In colder months, additional strain may be inferred from increased wear, as tasks become more physically demanding under less favorable conditions, with reduced daylight and harsher environments affecting both efficiency and endurance. Social structure, though less directly visible in skeletal remains, can be partially inferred through burial positioning and associated artifacts, indicating levels of inclusion or exclusion within community practices at the time of interment. Where remains are found without associated grave goods or clear markers, interpretation becomes more cautious, focusing on physical evidence rather than assumed social meaning, acknowledging the limits of what can be known with certainty. In some cases, multiple individuals are found in proximity, though not always in organized arrangement, suggesting either shared context of deposition or later disturbance that altered original positioning over time. Taphonomic processes, including animal activity, soil movement, and water flow, further complicate reconstruction, as bones may shift from their original location, requiring careful mapping and analysis to determine likely original placement. Despite these challenges, patterns do emerge across multiple sites, allowing for broader conclusions about general conditions rather than specific individual stories. These patterns emphasize consistency in lifestyle, diet, and physical activity across different regions. The individuals represented in these remains were part of a system that recorded their final moments in structured language, yet their daily lives remain visible only through indirect evidence, reconstructed slowly through careful study. This process of reconstruction does not produce dramatic narratives, but instead reveals steady routines, repeated actions, and gradual changes that define the lived experience more than any single recorded event. And so, through bone, soil, and chemical trace, a quieter picture forms, one of repetition, endurance, and ordinary existence within a structured society that documented outcomes more clearly than it documented lives. We will now move into the final stage, where mysteries, theories, and modern interpretations attempt to fill the remaining gaps, though often without reaching complete certainty. We arrive now at the quieter edge of this subject, where the records begin to thin, and certainty gives way to interpretation. where historians, archivists, and researchers move slowly through incomplete evidence, assembling possibilities rather than conclusions, and allowing space for uncertainty to remain where documentation has faded or never existed. One of the first enduring questions surrounding the punishment of being drawn and quartered is not about the act itself, but about its consistency, or rather, the lack of it. Records across regions describe similar procedures, yet small variations appear repeatedly, suggesting that what was written as a fixed sentence may not always have been carried out in exactly the same way. These differences are subtle, often embedded in phrasing rather than direct contradiction. One account may emphasize sequence, another may omit a step entirely, and a third may rearrange order without explanation. This raises the quiet possibility that local practice, availability of materials, or even individual interpretation influenced how procedures were actually performed. Another layer of uncertainty emerges when considering the role of officials. While the presence of sheriffs, clerks, and executioners is consistently recorded, their exact responsibilities are not always clearly defined in surviving texts. This leaves open questions about how decisions were made in the moment, and whether deviations from written procedure were acknowledged or simply unrecorded. Environmental factors may also have played a role in shaping outcomes. Ground conditions, weather, and available space could all influence how events unfolded, yet these details are rarely linked directly to procedural changes in the records. Instead, they appear as background notes, leaving modern readers to consider their possible impact without explicit confirmation. There is also the question of intention versus outcome. Medieval records tend to document what was supposed to happen, rather than what actually occurred in every instance. This creates a quiet gap between instruction and reality, where unexpected results, interruptions, or incomplete procedures may have taken place without being formally recorded. In some cases, later annotations suggest that not all outcomes matched expectations. These notes are often brief, written in margins or added during later copying, and they hint at irregularities without providing full explanation. A phrase altered, a line added, a word replaced, small changes that suggest something slightly different may have happened. Debates among historians often return to these small inconsistencies, examining them slowly, comparing versions, and considering whether they represent meaningful variation, or simply the result of copying errors accumulated over generations of transcription. There is also a broader question of frequency. While the punishment is well known in modern historical imagination, surviving records do not always indicate how often it was actually carried out. Some regions show multiple references, while others contain only a few scattered mentions across long periods of time. This uneven distribution suggests that the punishment may have been more symbolic than routine in certain contexts, serving as a legal possibility that reinforced authority rather than a regularly enacted procedure. Yet without complete records, this remains a careful interpretation rather than a confirmed conclusion. The individuals themselves remain largely anonymous within these debates. Their identities, when recorded, appear briefly and then disappear into the structure of legal documentation. Their personal experiences, thoughts, and reactions are not preserved, leaving modern analysis focused on systems rather than stories. From this absence, theories occasionally emerge, attempting to reconstruct human elements, though these remain speculative and are treated cautiously within academic discussion. The emphasis remains on what can be supported by evidence, rather than what might be imagined beyond it. As time moves forward, the punishment itself fades from practice, replaced by different legal frameworks and changing approaches to justice. This transition is gradual, occurring unevenly across regions, with older practices lingering in some areas longer than others, before eventually disappearing from active use. The physical remnants associated with such punishments, where they survive, become detached from their original context. Tools are repurposed, structures dismantled, materials reused. Only rarely do objects remain intact long enough to be preserved as historical artifacts. When they are preserved, they enter collections where their meaning shifts. No longer functional, they become objects of study, categorized by material, period, and association, placed in controlled environments where temperature and humidity are carefully managed. In museums, these artifacts are often displayed alongside explanatory text, which attempts to summarize complex historical practices into concise descriptions. Visitors pass by quietly, reading, pausing briefly, then moving on. The objects remaining still behind glass. In academic settings, the subject continues through research papers, lectures, and archival work. Historians revisit primary sources, compare translations, and refine interpretations, not with urgency, but with steady attention to detail and consistency. The punishment also appears occasionally in broader cultural contexts, though often simplified or stylized. These representations tend to focus on dramatic elements, while the procedural and administrative aspects that dominate historical records receive less attention. Over time, even these representations become less frequent as other subjects take their place in public awareness. The topic settles into a quieter position within historical study, present but not prominent, accessible but not widely discussed outside specific fields. What remains, ultimately, is a layered collection of records, fragments, and interpretations, each contributing to a broader understanding that is still incomplete. The gaps between them are not filled, but acknowledged, forming part of the subject rather than something to be resolved. And so the reality of being drawn and quartered does not conclude with a single definitive account, but instead rests within these archives, these preserved documents, these quiet rooms where parchment and ink continue to exist long after the events they describe. Day after day, year after year, they remain unchanged, waiting to be read slowly, carefully, without urgency, allowing their silence to carry as much meaning as their words. And so this chapter settles, not into a clear ending, but into stillness, where the records rest and the subject fades gently into the background of history. Good night.